Hello, everyone. I'm Grant Lewis. I'm one of the curators of our current exhibition, Michelangelo, the Last Decades, and I'm the chair for this evening's discussion of Michelangelo's cartoon of the so-called Epifania. Produced, we think, in the early 1550s, when Michelangelo was in his late 70s. The cartoon is one of the great treasures of the British Museum, and at over 2 meters high, one of the biggest drawings we have. Together with the painting made from it by Ascanio Condivi, currently by the cartoon side for the first time in 500 years in the exhibition, it is the centerpiece of our show, dwarfing over the other works we have assembled. It is undoubtedly impressive, one part of a trinity of cartoons by the great masters of the Italian Renaissance that we're lucky to have here in London, together with Leonardo's Burlington House cartoon at the National Gallery and the wonderful group of Raphael tapestry cartoons deposited at the V&A. A cartoon, in this instance, as will be explained more thoroughly later on, is a full-scale preparatory work, typically made as the final point of reference for an artist making a painting, a fresco, tapestry, or the like. The word comes from the Italian cartone, literally big paper. Michelangelo, we know, made plenty of cartoons for panel paintings and for frescoes, both in his native city of Florence and in the Sistine Chapel and Pauline Chapel in the Vatican. These cartoons were highly prized. Michelangelo esteemed at least one for the Sistine Chapel so much that he gave it as a gift to his friend Guido Altoviti. But the attention cartoons attracted in the Renaissance was often their downfall. We know that Michelangelo's cartoon for his unfinished fresco of the Battle of Cascina, a fresco made as a pendant to Leonardo da Vinci's famously disastrous Battle of Anghiari, proved such a hit with fellow artists that it soon disintegrated as figures from it were traced and copied. Giorgio Vasari, writing not many decades after the cartoon was made, could find only a few remaining fragments. Cumbersome and vulnerable to rot, damp, and fire, cartoons have low survival odds, and Michelangelo did not always help matters. He is alleged, in fact, to have instructed assistants to burn several of the cartoons he made for the Sistine Chapel. Just imagine if we had the ones surviving for the creation of Adam. But no, what we have instead are a few bits that were saved because they were in the same collection. One fragment of a cartoon for the Pauline Chapel, one cartoon of contested authorship, and this, the Epifania. It is, and this will not be the last time you hear us say this evening, the only complete surviving cartoon by Michelangelo. The cartoon is then of paramount importance to our understanding of Michelangelo as an artist, giving us a glimpse of a stage, a very late stage of his preparatory process that we'd otherwise know precious little about. It is, though, a little surprising, I think, that of all the Michelangelo cartoons that could have survived, the one that did make it through is this. For a work that was not a major project of Michelangelo's career, contemporaries only remark on the Epifania very briefly, and a work which remains a mystery on so many levels. We don't know who commissioned the painting, presumably an altarpiece that the cartoon was made for, and we're not really sure what the scene actually depicts. And then there are all sorts of questions about why Michelangelo chose the untested Condivi to realize his design in paint. This is a project that some contemporaries deemed a failure. Michelangelo doesn't seem to have been on hand to supervise poor Condivi very much. His energies were concentrated on much larger, more daunting tasks, like the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. But, subsidiary project though this might have been, the Epifania was simultaneously co-opted into Michelangelo's self-fashioning of his own image and his own legend, a task that was supremely important to him. There are also suggestions that the work's perplexing iconography was as much personal to Michelangelo as it was to any patron. Now, our exhibition gives us a perfect opportunity to think again about the many questions and paradoxes looming over the Epifania. This is, as I mentioned, the first time in 500 years that we've had the cartoon and Condivi's painting together. But we're also seeing the cartoon and painting with fresh eyes, as we've never seen them before, because we've had both the museum's cartoon and Condivi's painting conserved especially for the exhibition. They both look very different now to how they did even a few years ago. We have learned a huge amount from the work done on both Michelangelo's cartoon and Condivi's painting, as layers of dirt and reworkings have come off. The accumulations, changes and restorations of the past 5 centuries have coloured our interpretation of Michelangelo's work, and often quite literally. This is true for the physical changes to the drawing and painting, but it's also true of the many appellations and interpretations that have been applied to cartoon and painting after Michelangelo's death, as memories from the artist's lifetime faded and the works passed to new owners in different places, unleashing, it is fair to say, 5 centuries of head-scratching about Michelangelo's iconography. To tackle the many questions surrounding the Epifania, then, to try and imagine the works as best we can as Michelangelo knew them, we have to understand what has been added later. We have to understand the work's history in toto, all the way from Michelangelo's studio to the conservation labs here at the British Museum. And to do this, we have an all-stars team today who will take us through the cartoon's life story. First, we have Sarah Vowles, my curatorial partner in crime for our exhibition, who will look at the cartoon's iconography and creation in Michelangelo's lifetime. Then Daniel Godfrey, who worked on the museum's last Michelangelo show, who will guide us through the succeeding centuries as the cartoon changed hands and new owners and generations tried to grapple with what Michelangelo had depicted. He will chart the cartoon's movements and interpretation across Europe before it arrived at the British Museum in the late 19th century. And finally, we have Emma Turner, our senior paper conservator here at the museum, who will bring us right up to date as she outlines the historic and recent treatments the cartoon has undergone here at Bloomsbury. Most recently, the mammoth 6-year-long conservation completed right on time for our exhibition. So, without any further ado, Sarah will take us back to the 1550s to explore the cartoon's iconography and early years. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Grant. Well, as Grant has said so clearly, the Epifania is a remarkable thing. It's the only surviving complete cartoon by Michelangelo. And as Grant has said, cartoon comes from the Italian cartone, meaning large sheet of paper, and that is exactly what we're seeing here. The Epifania is made of 26 sheets of paper that have all been pasted together. And it's a preparatory drawing, probably coming at the end of a long series of earlier drawings, which fixes the final composition of, in this case, a painting. Now, often when we look at cartoons like this, there are signs of transfer, but Emma will talk later about the challenges of searching for technical evidence like this. Now, the context in which the Epifania was made, as Grant said, remains something of a mystery. There must have been a commission and a patron, otherwise it would never have reached this stage. But we have no record of either, nor do we know the context for which it was intended. The sheer scale of it suggests that it was intended as an altarpiece, but it's difficult to think of a church or chapel which would seek out an altarpiece with such mystifying iconography. Daniel's going to talk about the interpretation of the drawing in a moment, but I thought it might be helpful to start by talking you through what we can actually see. So, right in the middle, the Virgin Mary, remarkably monumental. If she were standing up, she would be larger by far than the other figures. Now, this is in some ways a reference back to artistic traditions. In medieval painting, figures were often sized according to their importance. So could this perhaps suggest that the Epifania was intended for a Marian-focused church or chapel devoted to the Virgin Mary. Next, here we have the infant Christ slumped between Mary's knees. He looks almost asleep. She seems to be drawing aside a piece of drapery in order to show him more clearly. Then, here, we have the young St. John the Baptist wearing his attribute of an animal skin garment, and he's peeking around the Virgin's knees at the infant Christ. This bearded man in the background is usually thought to be St. Joseph because we have other members of the Holy Family present. And as Daniel will explain in a moment, his presence could well be highly significant in our understanding of the message of the composition. You can see that the Virgin is reaching out towards this figure. It's not exactly clear what her gesture means. Is it reassurance, repudiation, inclusion, rejection? The jury's out. This young man in the left foreground is more of a mystery. He's leaning towards the Virgin in a very deferential way, but he has no attributes that help us to understand who he is. Could he be a prophet, a saint, or an angel? It's helpful to remember that in groupings of the Virgin and Child with saints, sometimes called Sacra Conversazione or Holy Conversations, we aren't bound by chronology. So an adult saint born hundreds of years after Christ can be shown alongside the infant Christ. We don't necessarily need to identify this young man as someone who is contemporary with Christ in the Bible. But what's the purpose of his interaction with the Virgin? What can we understand from that? And then we have these male heads in the background. Some of them are more highly finished than others, and we have to decide whether some of them are first ideas for the figure that we're calling St. Joseph, later abandoned, or whether they're all meant to be different people, some of whom were left unfinished. The same question goes for this faint head visible between the young man on the left and the Virgin Mary. Now, most of the time, we now think that this is probably a ghostly echo of the first position of the Virgin, who was then moved further to the right. But as we'll see, it was sometimes assumed to be a reference to yet another onlooker. In short, the Epifania is not the clear final model that you might hope for if you were the artist tasked with painting the finished picture, because Michelangelo himself, at this period, avoided panel painting. If we assume on stylistic grounds that the Epifania dates from around 1550, then he'd hung up his brush entirely, having recently finished the 2 frescoes in the Pope's private Pauline chapel, which were his final paintings in any medium. Now, at this date, we know that Michelangelo had a working partnership with Marcello Venusti, some of whose paintings we include in the show. We have examples such as the Chesi Annunciation, where we can see quite clearly how Michelangelo's original ideas were refined into finished models and given to Venusti to paint. Could Venusti have been the intended painter of the Epifania? It's certainly on a larger scale than the other works that he made after Michelangelo's designs, but those were intended for private devotion. An altarpiece was a different matter. But whatever the plan was for the Epifania, it didn't happen. The cartoon seems to have been left in its slightly unfinished state in Michelangelo's studio. Did the patron die? We don't know. With the increased power of the Roman Inquisition at this point, and the increased desire for clarity in religious imagery, was it felt too dangerous to continue with such unusual iconography? It certainly seems to be unique in terms of the composition, so unique that Michelangelo couldn't easily reuse it for any other commission of his own. But this white elephant lying around in the studio came in handy when Michelangelo wanted to show his appreciation to Ascanio Condivi, his young assistant who'd dutifully rushed out an authorized biography of Michelangelo in 1553 to counter some alleged errors in Giorgio Vasari's Life of Michelangelo from 1550, the first edition. We think now that Vasari's errors weren't in fact errors at all, but that Condivi's life gave Michelangelo a chance to present his life and career in a very flattering way. exactly as he wished. We can't quite go so far as to say that Michelangelo was dictating to Condivi, but his biography certainly shows that Michelangelo was a genius of noble descent, which was exactly what Michelangelo wanted everyone to believe. So Condivi was keen to become a painter. He was a young man from a noble family and had very little experience. And it seems likely that Michelangelo offered him the Epifania for him to use as the basis for a painting of his own, a leg up, if you like, at the start of his career. Now, Condivi leaps at the chance, but it proves to be a challenge of literally immense proportions. When we look at the painting and the drawing together, as you can see here, we can see that he sometimes struggled to interpret some of the admittedly very unclear elements of the cartoon. Daniel's going to talk a little bit more about some of these in a moment. Now, the painting takes some time to finish. We don't know if Condivi had his own workshop or whether he worked in Michelangelo's studio. But the fact that there are misunderstandings and amendments to the original cartoon suggests that Michelangelo's oversight wasn't quite as close as some people believe. Once the painting is finished, the cartoon goes back into Michelangelo's studio, and Condivi's painting seems to pass into the hands of a private collector in Rome. Some 50 years later, in 1608, it's sold by the collector's heir to Michelangelo Buonarroti the Younger, Michelangelo's great-nephew, who's in the process of setting up Casa Buonarroti as a museum in honor of his illustrious great-uncle. The great-nephew, rather optimistically, decides to display the painting as a work by Michelangelo himself, although Condivi's authorship is soon restored to it. And as for the drawing, well, it remains in Michelangelo's studio, one of several cartoons rolled up for storage, and it's still there on the day that he dies. We know this because, in line with usual practice, an inventory clerk is brought in the day after Michelangelo dies to record what's in his house, everything from clothes and household furniture to the art in the workshop. And among the cartoons that the clerk describes, there's this one, a cartoon with 3 large figures and 2 small. An addition in the margin specifies that this is called or known as the Epifania. This is the first time that the cartoon is given a title or a subject, and it's the beginning of centuries of confusion and interpretation, as Daniel will now explain, as he tackles the Epifania's life after it left Michelangelo's studio. Back to you, Grant.
Thank you very much, Sarah. There we have it, the cartoon documented in Michelangelo's studio, inventoried, as you say, with others that have disappeared. And reading the inventory taken after Michelangelo's death, inventories, I should say, you can, I think, begin to imagine the vicissitudes which have meant that the Epifania has survived, whereas other cartoons haven't. Now on to Daniel, who will pick up the baton in Rome in 1564 and take us all the way to London. Daniel.
Yes, thank you, Grant and Sarah, for those fantastic introductions. So I'm going to discuss the provenance, the passage of ownership of the cartoon until its arrival in the BM in 1895, and look at the often competing interpretations, as we've heard, of its subject. And at the end, I shall offer an interpretation of Michelangelo's cartoon, which focuses on its pictorial function as a design for an altarpiece. And I think this helps some of these problems with the subject recede if we do that. So as we've heard, Michelangelo died in his home-come studio in Marcel dei Corvi in Rome on 18th of February 1564. The very next day, an inventory of his possessions was made, including un altro cartone grande, dove sono disegnate e schizzate, another large cartoon where are designed, disegnate, schizzate, designed and sketched, 3 large figures and 2 small. There we are, and Sarah's pointed them out. 2 months later, on the 21st of April, 1564, an addition to the inventory allocated the ownership of the listed drawings. Our cartoon is identified as one of 2 drawings not taken to Florence by Leonardo Buonarroti, Michelangelo's nephew and heir, but remaining in Rome. The notary translates the earlier description into Latin, the legal language of Rome, and to further identify the cartoon, adds the words Nuncupato Epifania, called the Epifania. Now, our cartoon does not represent what we traditionally associate with the Feast of the Epiphany, the Magi bringing gifts. And many art historians have considered the notary's description a guess. However, we probably should take the title seriously, given the legal context and the oversight of Michelangelo's confidence, especially Tommaso dei Cavalieri. The title was almost certainly current in Michelangelo's orbit, in his circle. We have two further near-contemporary references that link our cartoon to Condivi's panel painting. In a letter to Vasari, a month later after Michelangelo's death, Daniele da Volterra described the drawings left in Michelangelo's studio, including quello che dipingeva Ascanio, the one that Ascanio Condivi painted, if you remember. Vasari then incorporated Daniele's information in his updated Lives of the Artists in 1568, describing how Condivi pestò parecchi anni intorno a una tavola, bashed away at a panel painting for many years. Good. Our cartoon remains in Rome then. It doesn't go to Tommaso de' Cavalieri, it goes to an unknown collector. And in 1600, it's described in the collection of Fulvio Orsini, in an inventory made shortly before his death in 1600. And in this inventory, the work is described as Quattro grande cornicciate di noce, a large painting in a walnut wood frame with a cartoon of a Madonna and a San Giuliano, a St. Julian, and other figures. This tells us that the cartoon was being treated and displayed as a painting, and this will have consequences for its conservation, as Emma will discuss, but also accounts for its survival. I mean, very interestingly, Epifania has been dropped, but Orsini almost certainly identified as San Giuliano, the figure to the left, so that this saintly figure interceding with the Virgin, and gestures towards us, whom Michelangelo imagined as the devout viewer. We'll return to San Giuliano in a second. Meanwhile, let's look, as we're talking about this saintly figure whom Orsini has identified as St. Julian, and Johannes Wilder eloquently named the speaker. I mean, the intimacy of the drawing on a large scale is remarkable. These gloriously pursed lips of the speaker as he dialogues with the Virgin on the cusp of speech, on the cusp of speaking to the Virgin, enunciation. We also see how Michelangelo drew the Virgin's head in profile, and it's almost like looking at a Picasso painting. So we have, if you follow the Virgin's line of her, the profile, the line of her neck, of her nose and through her lips, and then with that hold the back of her head in shade, you will see the profile, so the first drawn head of the Virgin. Then in a second moment, Michelangelo thinking aloud on a large scale, this cartoon scale, then essays, trials, the Virgin's head to the left in 3/4 profile, before then making the head into 3/4 profile, thinking all the while with this relationship between the speaker, potentially San Giuliano, and the Virgin. Great. Orsini's collection then, including our cartoon, passed to the Farnese. Orsini was an erudite canon associated with Farnese households. That was a natural progression of ownership. And thence to Carlo di Borbone, son of Elisabetta Farnese. And Carlo, in 1734, transported the Farnese collection to Naples, causing much consternation among the Roman conoscenti. The Farnese collection is still to be seen in Naples, in Capodimonte, the paintings, and then the glorious collection of antique sculpture in the Museo Nazionale Archeologico. Great, so the collection, our cartoon travels to Naples. Our documents show it was soon gifted to Cardinal Valente Gonzaga, who died in 1756, who returned the cartoon to Rome. There followed the upheavals of Napoleonic invasions, and the cartoon appears to have entered the hands of a French dealer in Rome, subsequently arriving in Britain, where it was acquired by the megalomaniacal collector of old master drawings, the renowned portrait painter Sir Thomas Lawrence. We owe him, and he bankrupted himself collecting drawings, but we owe him a great debt of gratitude. In 1876, Aurelio Gotti published the 1564 inventory discovered in the Archivio di Stato, the inventory giving the title Epifania, although he didn't link the Epifania with our cartoon, which at that point was in the Malcolm collection acquired by purchase by the BM in 1895, apart from our cartoon, which was bundled in as a gift, amazingly, the trustees driving a very hard bargain. The cartoon was displayed in the Prints and Drawings Gallery of the BM, where Sidney Colvin described it as Holy Family and Evangelists. In 1897, Jean-Paul Richter, to become a famous Leonardo scholar, saw the cartoon in the BM and made the connection with the Epifania, taking the title at face value and identifying the male figures as the Magi, although he admitted the presence of the child Baptist was problematic. In 1908, Henry Toda, a great German scholar of Michelangelo, returned to the Greek meaning of Epifania as manifestation of the divine. Toda saw the subject of the cartoon as the revelation of Christ's divinity. We, the viewers, see Christ. The background figures are yet to see the light. The saint in dialogue with the Virgin is identified as the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, who in Christian exegesis foretold the birth of Christ and the Baptist. Significantly, if we place the altarpiece destination to the fore, as I do, Isaiah is cited in the liturgy of the Feast of the Epiphany, and the first Sunday of the Epiphany octave is dedicated to the Holy Family. Toda's interpretation held sway until 1986, when Ernst Gombrich related Epiphania not to the subject, but the 4th century theologian Epiphanius, who argued for the perpetual virginity of the Virgin post the birth of Christ. Her outstretched hand towards Joseph, as Sarah has discussed, is seen as her spurning carnal relations, and the background figures are interpreted as the kin of Christ by Joseph's previous marriage and mentioned in the Gospels. Orsini St. Giuliano is identified as St. Julian of Antioch, whose cult is based on a vow of chastity beyond marriage. The principal objection to Gombrich, as Brian Sewell wrote in a typically irascible letter to the BM, is that it is highly unusual for a work to be described by its iconographic source. St. Joseph is behind the Virgin, but is her gesture one of rejection rather than reassurance, for example? Medieval theologians have worried over the Virgin's perpetual virginity beyond the birth of Christ, needing a pure vessel. But by the Renaissance, I think we can say this was settled. All Renaissance images of the Virgin incorporated the belief of her spotlessness in conception or the second after and life. The debate of the Immaculate Conception was still alive at this moment, but she was spotless either at her conception or the second afterwards. Let us conclude by looking at Condivi's panel. Condivi's painting is, after all, the first act of interpretation that we have. We might not think it's a flattering juxtaposition, but it is necessary. It's very difficult to imagine Condivi as the artist first intended to translate Michelangelo's cartoon into paint. And significantly, Vasari talks about Michelangelo giving the cartoon to Condivi. If it was the original commission, the artist would have been working more in tandem. However, it does give us an idea of what Michelangelo intended, and especially in the colours. The panel also demonstrates the paper losses of the cartoon to the left edge. Emma will discuss this in a second. And this has the effect in our cartoon of slightly shifting the Virgin right. If you add the strip of missing paper, she shifts right. And this reinforces the importance of our saintly speaker, whom Wilde called named speaker. Another detail here, Condivi has added a head between the speaker, although as we've seen, this cannot have been the artist's intention. Condivi added another male head where I think I see to the above right, we have a brown beard, brown haired beard. I think I see a tree trunk. I don't think there was a head there. Condivi has overpopulated his panel, weakening Gombrich's kin of Christ argument. Here we come to the crux, one of the most, the crux of the image. Condivi transcribes the Baptist pelts as rags and adds reins to the Virgin's hands, what Wilde calls Christ's leading strings. Can this have been Michelangelo's intention? Surely what we see is the Virgin lifting up her drapery to reveal her divine offspring to the viewer. And this was the opinion of the late Michael Hirst, who saw the cartoon out of its frame in 2005. Even great art historians such as Johannes Wilde, God to us in the British Museum, even such great art historians fell into the trap of reading our cartoon through Condivi's panel. If you look at the hand of the Virgin in the drawing, you see it's quite a way above the Christ child's head, compressed between the Virgin's legs, whereas in lifting drapery, which in Condivi's transcription, he's converted into these so-called straps, reins to hold Christ, but that diminishing this sense of revelation that I say the cartoon promotes. Great. Just a few sentences of summing up. In my opinion, Michelangelo's cartoon functions perfectly as the pictorial decoration above an altar in a chapel, providing the visual focus of the liturgy enacted before it. The saintly figure, who could but need not be Isaiah or San Giuliano or any saint with a hagiographic emphasis on chastity, reaches out into our space, acting as a visual link, a way into our devotion to the Virgin and her divine offspring revealed between her legs, her hand over the site of Christ's incarnation, her son's incarnation within her. St. Joseph's quizzical look, we'll take it to be St. Joseph, can be interpreted as a reaction to this miracle. In short, Michelangelo's cartoon fulfills the tenets, I would say, of the Counter-Reformation, in which our access to the divine is mediated by the priest at the altar and the saint in the image. And perhaps I should add, we have another divine figure to add, of course, the artist himself, the divine Michelangelo. With that, I hope that provides a good background to discuss Emma's and the history of the conservation of our wonderful cartoon.
Daniel, thank you very much. You took the Il Divino joke right out of my mouth. Thank you so much for covering so much ground for us. You get a sense there of how the treatment of the Epifania changes over time from a functional object in Michelangelo's studio to a finished work of art in the collection, as you say, Daniel, of Fulvio Orsini, and then in the Farnese, framed and displayed, as you say, as if it were a painting. A painting, it is worth adding, that when it was in Rome, was displayed in a building Michelangelo had paid some parts in designing. I should add that after the exhibition, once the cartoon goes back on permanent display in our Prints and Drawings gallery, we'll include a nod to its former appearance in Orsini's collection, courtesy of a beautiful new frame for the cartoon by Peter Schade, which is inspired by the frame mentioned in Orsini's inventory. I think that the cartoon was able to align to the boundary, if you like, between drawing and painting, because for Orsini, its manufacture didn't matter so much. Rather, it's the idea recorded that had value for him. What could have more value than an idea by Michelangelo? But, as Emma will now show us, the cartoon is very much a three-dimensional object, and to understand it in its original appearance as best we can, we must understand its materiality. Emma.
Thank you. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank everybody for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion today, as it's always a great opportunity to speak about the work of the British Museum's Collection Care Department. Although I'm the only Conservator presenting here this evening, it's vital to say that the 6-year conservation project was achieved as a team, though my teammates who you see here are owed a big acknowledgement. This presentation will be a broad overview, but it will hopefully give you a clear idea of the challenges we faced and the technical skills required during the treatment. To make this discussion as clear as possible, I have a lot of slides, so you'll have to forgive me for cantering through at pace. And I think that perhaps one of the things that I should do just straight off the bat, because there's been lots of mention to it, is sort of briefly describe how the cartoon has been treated over the centuries. So we heard Daniel say that the left edge has been lost. We think that this is likely due to irretrievable damage. So as Sarah mentioned, the cartoon was found rolled up in Michelangelo's studio at the point of his death. And this storing rolled on an end is likely to have contributed to mechanical damage and is also possibly associated with water damage. Say if there were a flood or if there was any sort of water lying on the ground, it would wick up from that end, again degrading the paper. And also we can see that the Epifania has been widely regarded drawing throughout the centuries, because we see numerous repairs throughout the centuries. There are several papers made from the verso of the cartoon and from the recto, indicating that it is a drawing that's been worthy of repair throughout the centuries. And so with that, I'm going to take you sort of up to the current day. And it's really important to say that for conservators, it's important to gather as much information as possible on an object's history. And this research can provide the context for the observed current condition and can help us to identify when and why interventions may have occurred. As such, I'm going to start by briefly highlighting changes which have occurred whilst the Epifania has been at the British Museum. Firstly, we believe that the Epifania was presented to the museum mounted on the pine wood panel and within the oak frame, which were recorded in the 1860s Christie's sale. It seems very likely that the frame was retained, at least initially, as the Epifania was exhibited on a screen shortly after arrival, and the frame would have offered an easy method of display. As unlikely as it may seem, this is the first known photograph of the Epifania. Taken in the 1920s, it shows the Epifania installed over the stairs between the Prince Enduring student room and the mezzanine. By the early 1950s, the cartoon had moved to Gallery 90. In 1961, Edward Croft Murray, then keeper of the Princeton Drawings Department, advocated for changing the gallery display of the Epifania, stating that the glazing caused distracting reflections. This photograph is dated from 1971, and is the first time that we can definitely say that the Epifania is without a frame, instead being shown in a dedicated display case. The change in display appears to have coincided with paper being directly adhered onto the recto of the drawing. This was presumably to reinforce the mounting attachment and, in covering the irregular edges of the cartoon, provided a neater presentation. Skip back. The Epifania continued to be displayed within a wall case until 2006, with only minor changes in display occurring as the galleries were periodically refreshed. In 2006, a more significant change occurred. A new frame was made from gelatine wood, which allowed the Epifania to be included in the British Museum's Room 5 exhibition, Michelangelo drawings closer to the master. At the conclusion of the exhibition, the Epifania returned to Gallery 90A, where it was installed on a wall. Additionally, in 2006, whilst the Epifania was removed from display, the opportunity was taken to scientifically analyse the cartoon, as there was concern that the pine wood panel on which the cartoon was mounted was causing damage. Solid phase microextraction sampled the air between the cartoon and the panel and found that significantly higher levels of acetic acid were present when compared with the ambient air above the drawing. This confirmed that without conservation, the long-term future of the Epifania would be at risk. The conservation project began in 2018, following the opening of the museum's World Conservation and Exhibition Centre. This new building provided the versatile space required to treat works as large as the Epifania. The first treatment stage was to document the condition, and this was achieved using a variety of methods. Firstly, a digital condition map was created, and a detail is seen here on the left. Secondly, the cartoon was photographed in a variety of lighting conditions, which included ultraviolet and infrared light. And thirdly, the Factum Foundation captured high-resolution 3D scans to record the cartoon surface, and we see a detail here on the right. All of these results were integrated into a multi-layered digital archive, which could be constantly referred to throughout the conservation. The next treatment stage was to lift the cartoon from the pine panel. Between the 1950s and the 1980s, 4 layers of paper and textile strips had been adhered onto the recto and wrapped around to the verso of the panel. These had to be carefully removed, layer by layer, using scalpels and tweezers. Once the layers had been removed, it was possible to lift the Epifania away. The black chalk and charcoal media were tested in dry and wet conditions to ensure that they remained stable on the paper surface, whilst the cartoon was face down during the treatment. The media was stable, but the paper surface was seen to be fragile, varying from soft and powdery to very brittle. Therefore, the paper surface and the media were consolidated by spray application of 0.5% gelatin, working sequentially across the surface and ensuring an even coverage. We were then able to turn the cartoon over for the first time. Given the size and the fragility of the Epifania, this was a very difficult job. We established that the safest way to turn the cartoon was to sandwich it in soft and inert layers between 2 rigid boards. Additional rigidity was provided by wooden battens that were clamped onto the outside of the boards. Each turning took hours of material preparation, rehearsal, and 8 conservators. Having been turned over, it was possible to observe the verso for the first time. It was immediately clear that a low-quality brown lining paper had been adhered across the entire verso of the cartoon. The brown paper was seen to include pigment particles, broken wood fibres, it tore easily, and it bleached brown discoloration. The adhesive had also failed in several areas, creating air pockets, which undermined the overall level of support offered. The combination of these factors led us to decide that the brown paper had to be removed and replaced with a new conservation-grade lining. We knew that moisture would be required to aid the lining removal. However, uncontrolled introduction of moisture posed the risk of moving discoloration at random, negatively altering the appearance of the cartoon. It would also cause the cartoon to expand and contract, placing the degraded paper under damaging mechanical strain. To counteract this risk, we sought highly controlled methods to introduce moisture. We achieved this by using chemical hydrogels, which hold a large volume of water within their structure and which is transmitted through tiny pores. An example of a chemical hydrogel, which most people are familiar with, is a contact lens. The hydrogels were cut into small squares, placed onto the lining paper, and once the paper was sufficiently humidified, it was removed using blunted scalpels, spatulas, and tweezers. We also made rigid sheets of 3% gel and gum, which we cut into shapes and used to deliver extra moisture where it was required. Tiny splints of Japanese tissue were adhered to temporarily support tears, which were revealed as the lining was removed. These temporary repairs allowed us to continue working, but return later to make proper repairs which ensured the correct alignment. And this is a slide where you can see an example of the historic repairs which have been made to the back of the cartoon. They're quite large, they're quite broadly applied, and they don't necessarily always catch the tears, which was not ideal. Working with often 6 people a day, it took us nearly 7 months to remove the brown lining paper. This is an image of the cartoon verso, and although not beautiful, it's worth pointing out that very few people have seen it. At this point, we're in the position to repair the numerous tears and fractures within the cartoon paper. This was achieved by using a Japanese kozo fibre paper and wheat starch paste. Kozo fibres are very long, meaning that the paper is strong, even when incredibly lightweight. You can see that we dyed the paper to a brown colour so that it wouldn't be visible behind any hairline fractures. Losses within the cartoon paper were infilled with a different Kozo fibre paper, which was also dyed. And at the same time, those historic repairs that we'd just seen were thinned down as they were inflexible and were causing damage to the cartoon. Whilst we worked, we continually had to restrain the cartoon paper by attaching it to the table, and we did this by using temporary margins. We also had to use numerous weights, which are visible in the image on screen. These actions minimise the extent to which the degraded paper could distort and could contract inwards. As we progressed to the treatment towards a new lining, a border to surround the cartoon was prepared. This compensated areas of loss at the edges, making the cartoon more structurally stable, and it also allowed the recently uncovered edges to be displayed at a later date within a new frame. Relining the Epifania with conservation-grade papers was the most important stage of the treatment. Relining was essential, as to mount and frame the cartoon for display, it must be strong enough to hold its own weight. The British Museum's East Asian Paintings Conservators, who are experts in handling and lining large format artworks, were crucial in successfully achieving this treatment stage. We decided that 3 layers of Japanese Kozo fibre paper should be adhered across the verso of the cartoon. The Kozo paper selected was chosen in 3 weights, and were applied from lightest to heaviest, increasing the strength of the cartoon with each lining. Here we see the application of the first lining layer, which was made using squares of 9 by 9 centimetres. The second layer of the lining was then applied. The lining papers were increased in size to 9 by 18 centimetres, and the grain direction of the paper was rotated so that an intrinsic curl wasn't imparted to the cartoon. This is the verso of the cartoon with 2 complete layers of lining. The third layer of the lining was to be achieved using 8 rows of paper, which span the full width of the cartoon. To successfully realise this, the entire cartoon had to be lightly humidified so that an equilibrium was maintained between the lined and unlined areas. Without this equilibrium, the cartoon would undulate in response to the wet adhesive, and it would be impossible to continue the lining process. The strips of lining paper were pasted with wheat starch paste and carried into position. The lining was then precisely applied, working with brushes to ensure excellent adhesion with no air bubbles. Whilst the lining was being applied, the whole team was required, working to establish registration points for the lining strips, attend to and adjust the humidifying materials, and to keep work surfaces clear so that the process could flow without interruption. Once the final lining had been applied, the Epifania was turned face up and attached to a wooden drying board to dry evenly and under light tension. This ensured that the cartoon was drying as flat as possible and without distortions. Access to the recto meant that it was possible to adjust the tone of the dyed paper infills. The range of brown tones within the cartoon was enormous, so each infill was matched to the tone of the surrounding cartoon paper with watercolour. And it's important to say that we only retouched the infills and would never retouch the original work of art itself. The aim of toning was to visually integrate the losses rather than restore the missing areas of the drawing. And here we see an example of what can be achieved using toned infills. At the same time, small infills were applied to areas of the recto which had been historically braided or skimmed. These were adhered in position and again toned to the surrounding area. In conjunction with the work carried out directly on the cartoon, a new conservation-grade panel was prepared to mount the cartoon onto. Our conservation mounters worked with colleagues based at London's National Gallery to develop and make the panel. It was made from cellite, which is an inert aluminium honeycomb sheet material, and in this case it was faced with aluminium. The cellite panel was encapsulated within mount board, which provided additional buffering material. Here, our conservation mounters are adhering a final layer of mount board onto the panel. All joins and edges were then sanded to give a very high level of finish. With this, the time had come to mount the Epifania on its new panel. The cartoon was released from the drying board, which then allowed strips of mounting material to be adhered on top of the Kozo paper borders. This photo shows us in the process of moving the cartoon from the drying board onto the panel. The Epifania was then precisely centred, and the strips of mounting material were adhered with wheat starch paste to the sides and to the back of the panel, and 2 teams worked in unison throughout. And here we see the Epifania mounted on its new panel. Mounting made it possible to move the Epifania to an upright position for the first time in 6 years. This was very important, as it allowed us to observe how the mounting performed. It also allowed us to check how our toned infills appeared in different lighting conditions, and allowing us to adjust them where necessary. Having started the project in 2018, in March this year, we finally finished work on the Epifania. With the treatment complete, the Epifania was given a new frame. The frame is larger so that the uncovered edges can be seen, and it's been designed to provide a controlled environment around the cartoon, meaning that it also functions as part of the long-term preservation strategy. For all the conservators, it was hugely rewarding to see the Epifania installed in Michelangelo the last decades, especially being displayed next to Condivi's painting. With the conclusion of the treatment, we were also able to reflect on what conservation had added to the understanding of the Epifania. Firstly, Kean's digital microscopy revealed that the drawing media was not only black chalk, which we see here, but also charcoal, which is characterized by more irregular, splinter-like particles that often sit in gaps between the paper fibers. The charcoal seen here is identified in the soft shading across the Virgin's left foot. As recently as 2005, the Epifania was thought to be drawn on a discolored blue paper, and this is likely to be because of the presence of blue paper infills, which we see a glimpse of here. Fibre analysis and the removal of the brown lining paper categorically demonstrated that the cartoon paper is a natural off-white colour, although now very discoloured to brown. During examination in 2018, new technology revealed that the watermarks within the cartoon paper are an encircled anchor surmounted by a star. This was an exciting revelation, as papers with this watermark have been noted as amongst Michelangelo's most favoured for drawing. Underneath the brown lining paper, the impression of 2 separate canvas linings was observed within the adhesive residue. In some areas, small fragments of the textile were also found. And combining these observable features with academic research, we now know that one of these linings was applied before 1753, as an inventory of that date refers to the large cartoon stretched on canvas. As has already been mentioned, the cartoon sheet consists of 26 sheets of paper. The papers are arranged in 4 columns of 5 rows, and a single column at the left edge formed of 6 rows. However, in looking at where the papers overlap each other, it wasn't clear how the whole sheet was constructed. To solve this puzzle, we made a scaled-down version of the Epifania. By looking at the pattern of the overlapping joins and trialling how they worked in practice, we think that the whole cartoon sheet was formed from groups of paper, first joining 2 pieces of paper together with flour paste, and then joining a pair into a notionally square group of 4. Groups of 4 were then joined to another group of 4, and the cartoon size increasing to the desired size and rectangular shape. The left edge, which is formed of the 6 rows of regularly sized papers, appears to have been added last. We think that the primary advantage of grouping papers like this is that it would have been expedient for creating a large sheet, whilst for the majority of its creation remaining very handleable. And finally, we were able to contribute to one of the Epifania's most puzzling questions, namely, how was the design transferred to Condivi's panel? Unusually, the Epifania retains no direct evidence of the method used to transfer its design, but the close correspondence between the cartoon and the painting showed that design must have been transferred. Michelangelo's drawn outlines have not been pricked, creating small holes that black chalk or charcoal could be pounced through, and there is also no evidence within the cartoon for indented transfer, which would have used the pressure of a metal stylus to physically mark the panel with the design. Our practical research suggests that the design may have been transferred using an intermediary sheet of paper prepared to approximate the size of the cartoon and blackened with charcoal. The intermediary sheet would have been placed underneath the cartoon, charcoal side onto the intended painting surface, and the outlines of the cartoon would have been followed with a drawing tool. Experiments found that very little pressure is required to transfer charcoal deposits from the intermediary sheet, and that a design could be transferred with little or no mark, on the original cartoon, exactly as we have found with the Epifania. And with that, I want to once more highlight my colleagues' contributions and say thank you for listening, and I'll hand back to Grant, who will chair any questions.
Thank you very much, Emma. Yes, we're now brought completely up to speed. Thank you to everyone for joining us. As Emma says, we do have some time for questions, so do keep sending them through. We do have a load that we can get started though on team, if you're ready to for me to field some, your direction. Question number 1. Is it still believed that the head of St. Joseph is actually a Michelangelo self-portrait complete with a broken nose? My personal view, I mean, likenesses is always in the eye of the beholder. Personally, I don't see that myself. Does anyone have any views on that one?
I think that was Robinson's idea, or perhaps in the 19th century. I think it's thought of as a way of increasing the value of the cartoon in the 19th century. And I think it's sort of quite rapidly dropped in the 20th, but I might be wrong.
That was, sorry, Sarah.
I was just going to say, and I suppose essentially, old, faintly grumpy looking men with beards all look the same to some degree.
Yeah, so that was my understanding, and I wouldn't expect much identification on Michelangelo's part with St. Joseph. So moving quickly on, because we don't have that much time, there is mirroring between the Madonna and the mystery figures' respective stances. The leg position and the foot seem to be almost identical. Thoughts?
So I thought of this. The composition has great symmetry. The 3 figures, the virgins. In a way, the saintly figure. There is mirroring. Their bow, their outer contours are bowed. I think the saintly's right. Is it right? No, he's made left-handed. His left hand gestures towards us, and his left leg comes out towards us. So there is a mirroring. I think I would say this is the sort of a necessary symmetry linking the two, fulfilling the sort of liturgical, devotional sort of emphasis in the picture.
I would also say that both of these poses, to some extent, draw on a particular, what we call the striding pose, which is something which Michelangelo was very fond of at this date, and we see variants of that pose appearing in many of his works from the period, his frescoes in the Pauline Chapel as well, for example, and in numerous drawings where we see this pose recurring. So it's obviously something that's playing on his mind. Absolutely. And so it's natural that he should seek to add dynamism by including... Yeah.
And even earlier, it's the prophet in the Sistine ceiling, and it's a sort of a motif.
Yeah.
I'd always call it a Pinker style rhythm of legs, which you often see in designs from the 1550s. Moving swiftly on. Fascinating talks and wonderful exhibition in the British Museum. Thank you. Your check is in the post. I have been struck by the miniature detail within the features of the subjects, for example, with the eyes and the physiques of other figures in his drawing. I may be imagining much, but I see lots of imagery. He asked Vittoria Colonna to view the crucifixion drawing with a looking glass and a mirror. I wonder why, and if this has been done by anyone since for any of his drawings.
Shall I take that on?
Please do.
So the way that Vittoria was looking at the crucifixion drawing was actually her own invention. It's not something that Michelangelo told her to do. She actually adopted that as a way to appreciate it more and to focus her attention more on the holy scene that's being represented. I mean, I certainly imagine that most of us have studied the drawings quite closely with magnifying glasses over the years. And I mean, they certainly reward that kind of close inspection. So I think, that at least is an aspect that we do follow her in.
Yes, absolutely. This culture of closeness, so to speak, when Michelangelo is absolutely focused on every last iconographic detail in his work. Question number 4, where was the Condivi painting conserved recently? It was conserved by an absolutely wonderful restorer, conservator in Florence, Dede Nozzoli, ciao Dede, if you're watching, who has done an absolutely extraordinary job. I think we can all agree. And who, very interestingly, because the painting has a huge number of losses to it, it was quite difficult to reconstruct in places. And to help her fill in the losses, Dedo goes back to the cartoon.
Okay.
So in a way, 500 years later, 5 centuries later, the cartoon became a functional object for the painting yet again. Question for Emma, now moving down. Emma, which sort of woods did you mention as being around the cartoon?
Oh, so there was pine wood, which was mounted, the part cartoon was mounted on, and it certainly was increasing the level of acetic acid between the cartoon and the panel itself, which was, it's a degrading product and sort of autocatalytic as well. So once it starts degrading, it continues to do so.
Great, thank you very much. And I will just stay with you for our last question, Emma, if I may. Were there spot tests done with other techniques during the conservation process?
Well, we certainly spot tested the media using wet and dry techniques to make sure that didn't move. We made sure that the cartoon, well, we had to check to see how absorbent the cartoon was itself and how absorbent the various infill papers were. And yes, constantly looking at the materials that we were using mock-ups with as similar papers as we could find, although would you believe the 16th century papers are quite hard to come by. And yeah, critically examining every step of the way. So we really felt that we were using the right materials for the job.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I think very sadly that is all we have time for, but thank you to everyone watching wherever you are in the world. I must flag our next event in our Michelangelo programme, which will be here at the British Museum on Friday, the 26th of July. And it is an evening of art and poetry as we explore Benjamin Britten's settings of 7 of Michelangelo's poems set to music, the 7 sonnets of Michelangelo. And this is a very exciting news flash. We are delighted to announce that we will have the world-renowned accompanist Roger Vignoles and acclaimed tenor Alessandro Fischer performing with us in person at the museum. This promises to be a wonderful performance. You can buy tickets on our website. I very much hope to see you there. It does promise to be a wonderful evening. But in the meantime, thank you for joining all of us, and goodbye from the British Museum. Goodbye.